Okay, so in this lesson, what I want to talk about is this idea of the cell. So the cell. Now, within biology, basically what the cell is, so the cell is the smallest working unit of a living organism. So a cell is the smallest working element of a living organism. So this is your definition of what a cell is. Again, the cell is the smallest working element of a living organism. So when you think about a cell is basically made up of different parts. Now we have all different types of cells in our body. So for example, we have red blood cells. So red blood cells. So we have red blood cells. And these red blood cells are really, really important. What they do is they actually carry oxygen all around the body. So that would be an example of a cell. We also have these other things that are called white blood cells. So imagine this is your white blood cell. So you have white blood cells. Okay, so white blood cells are really, really important in relation to defense in the body. For example, your immune system. We have muscle cells. Okay, so they're kind of like long, fibrous kind of cells like this, and they have these parts in it. These are called nucleus. And these are called muscle cells. So muscle cells. And again, muscle cells, they're used to move bones, for example, in the body. So muscle cells. You also have, so this guy here. Okay, and it has a nucleus as well. And this is what's known as a sperm cell. So sperm cells. And they use this, so they basically can swim, so they use this as their tail. And they use the tail to swim. So they're known as sperm cells. And then also then within the brain then you have these they kind of look like this. And they make up the basic units in the brain. They kind of have branched arms like so. And then they have this kind of long sheets that come out like so. And these are what are known as, this is the nucleus. And these are, and also as well, they're full of this stuff called cytoplasm. And these are what are known as nerve cells. So nerve cells. So again, like if we look at this guy here, so it has a nucleus, and then it's also full of cytoplasm. So the red blood cells, it doesn't have a nucleus. So all of these here are all examples of this thing that we call a cell. So you have, and all of these make up different cells. What happens then is these cells come together and they form up different systems. So for example, like a muscle, for example, if you take your traps that are on your back. So they're going to be made up of trillions of these types of muscle cells, and they're all joined together to make up a system, or the muscle in your body. If you take your immune system, for example, it's going to be made up of millions of these white blood cells. So when infection gets into your body, white blood cells are released, and those white blood cells attack any invading organisms. If we take and white blood cells and red blood cells make up part of the blood in your body. So red blood cells, as I was saying, they combine with oxygen, so they take oxygen from the lungs and they transfer them all around the body. If you were to look into your brain, for example, and you were to go down into one of the smallest functioning or working units within the brain, it would be made up of trillions of these like nerve cells that are all attached and joined together. So these are just some examples of cells. Now what you will notice is that they have a lot of features in common. So for example, most of them have this stuff called cytoplasm, which is a semi-liquid that's inside in the cells. Also as well, you notice that a lot of them have what's called a nucleus. Okay, and we're going to talk about these different parts of the cell. So for example, the sperm has a nucleus as well. Now there's very common, so every cell, even though they're different, they all have different functions within the body. They all have very similar properties as well, which is what we're going to look at now. So if we were to take a cell, what's the basic, what is the structure of a cell, and what are these parts that make up a cell? What are they? So if we take, let's say, the animal cells, we're going to look at two different types of cells. So you have plant cells, and then you have what are called animal cells. So the animal cell. So the animal cell, we want to look at the different parts of the cell. So if I draw a structure that looks something like this. So this first outer part here is what's known as the cell membrane. And the cell membrane is mostly made of fats, and it doesn't allow everything through it. So generally it allows small substances through, for example water, but not large substances, for example proteins. So this is like the animal cell, this is like the cell membrane, or it's the boundary. Now if you were to take a section of this and kind of magnify it, it's made up of these fats that are kind of connected like this. And they have this kind of a tail that looks something like that. So it's this membrane. And within the membrane then you have like these proteins that are kind of contained within this membrane. Something like this. And what they will do is they will let things in. So for example, they'll let in water, so H2O. So they will let in water, and they'll also let in things like glucose. So C6H12O6. So this is water, and this is glucose. So they, for example, they will let things into the cell. So imagine these are your molecules here on the outside, and what will happen is they'll pass through into the cell, like so, because the cell needs water, and it needs things like glucose as well. Now also then what will happen is when waste is produced inside in the cell, so imagine you have waste, the waste needs to get out as well. So this cell, it acts like a barrier, and it'll let waste out. So it'll let things like water and food in, and then it'll let other substances like waste products out. So that's one part of the cell, and it's called the cell membrane. We have these other things then, this other really obvious part inside in the cell. It's kind of like in the center of the cell, and we'll call this the nucleus. Just draw an arrow. So the nucleus. So the nucleus carries these things called chromosomes. So, okay, so it has these things that are called chromosomes. so chromosomes. And these are which are made up of genes that control the workings of the cell. So these chromosomes so you can think of them like these long, like kind of coiled structures. And then within these, let's say you have these things called genes. So you have genes. And the genes then, if you're to look at a gene, let's say, and you're to break down the gene, it's going to be made up of this stuff called DNA. And these chromosomes, what they do is they, like, for example, so eye color, these genes, for example, genes will code for things like eye color. Okay, so the genes, if you like, so within the nucleus you have these chromosomes. The chromosomes are like a storage space for these things called genes. And if you're to look at genes and break them down, genes are made up of DNA. And genes it's the way that the body carries information. Like, for example, things like the color of your eyes. So if you're to go into the cells in your eyes and you're to go into the nucleus and you're to look at the genes, there's going to be a specific gene for your specific eye color. So the nucleus carries chromosomes, which are made up of genes that control the workings of the cell, and genes are made up of DNA. Okay, so you have chromosomes contain these things called genes, and genes are made up of DNA. And the nucleus, if you like, it's like the control center. So it's the control center for the cell. So the control center, it controls everything inside the cell. Within it then, like you can think about the cell, it's like a bag, and within the bag, all of these, like for example the nucleus and other parts of the cell that we're going to look at, it contains this stuff called cytoplasm. So cytoplasm. And cytoplasm it's made mostly of water and salts. So within this, so the majority of the cell is made up of water, and then there's these things called salts that are dissolved in the cell. And this is why it's important that we drink loads of water, because if we think like our bodies are made up of trillions of these cells, and in order for the cells to function properly, we need to have water and we need to have salts within the body as well. So you can think about this, you can think about the cell like a bag, and it contains the outside of the bag, or the boundary is the cell membrane. There's a control center in the middle called the nucleus, and then you have this liquid substance called cytoplasm, which is mainly made up of salt and water. And also within here, you're going to have, for example, glucose and other food materials in it as well. So, for example, when glucose is coming into the body, it'll be dissolved, or it'll be inside in this like liquidy substance inside the cell called cytoplasm. Then you have these other things, these other substances, and they're kind of like the powerhouse of the cell. I'm just going to draw one of them in here. And these things are called mitochondrions. So mitochondrion. Mito, M-I-T-O, chondrion. So the mitochondrion. And these are known as the powerhouse. So they're the powerhouse of the cell, and this is where food reacts with oxygen to release energy, and this process is called respiration. So, for example, also as well, what will be coming into the cell, you'll have oxygen, O2. So oxygen and glucose, for example, oxygen is taken in through the lungs, glucose is taken in through your digestive system, and they make their way down. They make their way to the mitochondria. And then in the mitochondrion, what happens is the oxygen and the glucose is combined together, and this releases energy. And this process of releasing energy from food is called respiration. Okay, respiration, and that's the release of energy from food. So respiration, and this respiration, it happens inside in the mitochondrion, inside these tiny parts of the cell. Also then as well, you have these other substances, these other tiny, like you can think about them like little worker substances, and we'll just draw a few of them in here. And these guys here are what are called ribosomes. So ribosomes. Ribosomes is where cells produce proteins. So these ribosomes, they produce proteins. So proteins are just structures that the body can produce, and these proteins then make up all these different parts of the cells. So these ribosomes are where, for example, proteins are produced. So you have these things called ribosomes. So ribosomes is where cells produce proteins, for example, the hormone insulin. So an example of some of these proteins would be the hormone insulin. And your body uses this insulin to absorb, for example, sugars and glucoses. So they are produced by these parts of the cells called ribosomes. In your mouth then as well, these ribosomes in the cells in your mouth, they produce this enzyme called amylase. And then also there's this other enzyme, or this other proteins that are produced in your skin called collagen as well. But these are made by these ribosomes. So it's very important that you're able to draw this, to draw a cell, that you're able to label the parts of the cell. So for example, you have the membrane, you have the nucleus, you have the cytoplasm, you have the ribosomes, you have the mitochondrion, and you have the cell membrane. Now also then as well, you need to know the function of each of these. So if we take the cell membrane, for example, the function of the cell membrane is to allow substances in and out of the cell. So for example, it allows these substances in and out of the cell, and it's also there to protect the cell as well. If we take the cytoplasm, so this substance here, so what's its function? It's a watery fluid that these organelles or parts of the cell float in. The nucleus, then this guy here, so the nucleus contains genes that controls the cell. So remember, it contains genes, and these genes control the cell. So you can think about it as like the control center. The mitochondrion then as well. So this is another part of the cell, and this is where energy is released in respiration. So you need to know this. You need to know the function of this part of the cell. And then these ribosomes here. So ribosomes, they're where proteins are made. So again, this is the animal cell. And what we're going to do is we're going to, like in the next lesson, we'll move on and we'll start to look at the animal cell. So again, just as a recap, so we looked at this idea of the cell. So the cell is the smallest working element of a living organism. So some examples, if we were to look inside the human body, for example, we have muscle cells, we have white blood cells, which are involved in the immune system, we have red blood cells, we have nerve cells in the brain, and we have sperm cells then as well that are involved in reproduction. We have all of the parts then of the cell. So for example, starting on the outside, you have this thing called the cell membrane. It allows substances in and out of the cell, and it protects the cell. You have the nucleus. So this is in the middle of the cell, and it's like the control center for the cell. And it contains chromosomes, what are called chromosomes, and then on those chromosomes you have these things called genes. Genes code for different features. For example, in the human body, things like eye color will have a gene associated with it, and genes then are made up of this substance called DNA. You have this semi-liquid substance that's inside the cell called cytoplasm, and it contains water and salt. You have these other things that are called ribosomes, and they produce proteins. So for example, insulin. So they're like they make proteins. They take the food that you eat and they turn it into proteins that it uses then to make up the different parts of the cell. Then we have the powerhouse of the cell, which is called the mitochondrion, and that's involved in this process of respiration. So for example, oxygen taken in from the lungs and glucose taken in from the body are combined here in what's called the mitochondrion, and they release energy from the food, which is a process that's called respiration. So again, that's the cell, that's the part of the cell. and the human cell. So it's important that you can reproduce this and you can draw it and that you know what all the different parts are. Okay, thank you for listening.